maybe the best way to respond is to say the people who take all the money in the room always end up, or usually end up, with less than the people who don't take the extra $1,000. So here's the reason. I mean, why should one take all the money in the room? Well, there might be some reason for it, but there seems to be a good reason against it, which is the people who take all the money in the room usually, or in some versions of the problem invariably, end up doing worse.
So welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we're happy to have Professor Arif Ahmed. He is philosopher at the University of Cambridge, where he became fellow of Gonville and Caius College in 2015, University Reader in Philosophy in 2016, and Nicholas Sallnow-Smith College Lecturer in 2019. His primary philosophical interests are in philosophy include decision theory and the philosophy of religion. His books include Saul Kripke, as well as Evidence, Decision, and Causality. He's editor of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, A Critical Guide, and Newcomb's Problem. He's also published many articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome Professor Arif Ahmed.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
All right, and I'll just note for the other people in the listening to the AMA, if you want to ask questions, you can post them in the AMA questions channel, or you can request to be unmuted and ask in the VC as well. So,
Alex Malpass says hello, by the way.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Give my thank you.
You've done you had a discussion with Alex about some of your work on miracles, I believe that was correct.
Yeah, that's right. I've known Alex for a few years. We did a bit of work on he'd done some work on fatalism and the sort of fixed versus unfixed future some years ago. We did some work on that. And then we had an interesting discussion on the stuff about miracles and sort of Bayesian approaches to Hume's argument a few years later.
Great. So I'm someone I've been a big fan of yours for some time, and I've read a lot of your work on decision theory, and especially as it relates to Newcomb's problem. And so I have a bunch of questions related to that. And I think sort of as a first question, I want to pose an argument I've had people give in favor of taking both boxes in Newcomb's problem. They say something like this, right? Once you're in the room, right, where you're making your choice, you know that there is either exactly $1,000 in the room or exactly $1,001,000 in the room, and your choice doesn't change what is in fact in the room. So accordingly, you might as well just take the contents of both boxes to ensure that you get all the money in the room. What do you think of this approach?
I think maybe the best way to respond is to say that the people who take all the money in the room always end up, or usually end up, with less than the people who don't take the extra $1,000. So here's the reason. I mean, why should one take all the money in the room? Well, there might be some reason for it, but there seems to be a good reason against it, which is that the people who take all the money in the room usually, or in some versions of the problem invariably, end up doing worse. So I think whilst that does make a kind of intuitive case, part of the point of Newcomb's problem is that there are cases where both options seem intuitive in one sense and counterintuitive in the other sense. And it seems to be the general argument for evidential decisionship theory would work against that argument as well.
Fair enough. On Wednesday, we had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Graham Priest, and he has a 2002 paper called Rational Dilemmas. You might be familiar. And, well, essentially he argues that Newcomb's problem is a case of a rational dilemma where we're in fact obligated to perform the impossible. So I think I'm wondering what you think of his argument for why taking both boxes is obligatory, which goes something like this. Let C be an abbreviation for the description whatever now is in box A, where this is understood to be a rigid designator. So if we make, I think he uses alpha. So if we make alpha true, then we get the conditional MA entails GC. I think that's, if we make alpha true, then we get C, what's in fact in box A. And that's one boxing. And if we make beta true, then we'll get C plus the extra money, right? And if we make B, then we get C plus 1,000. It uses 10. But C plus 1,000 is greater than C. And so he has a principle of rationality that it follows that we ought to take both boxes. We ought to make it the case that beta is true. So what do you make of this sort of argument? And I guess also, what do you make of the suggestion that we are sometimes rationally obligated to perform the impossible?
I think what I would, so the first thing I would say is that I would reject the principle R. So the principle which says that, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how the principle is supposed to be spelled out, but the principle that says that, rigidly designating whatever's in the opaque box by A, principle which says if you make A true, then you get C. If you make B true, then you get C plus the extra money. Therefore, since 10 plus C is greater than C, or the extra money plus C is greater than C, therefore you ought to make A true. So that's the bit that I reject. And the reason I reject it is because if you make A true, then the amount of money you get is more than the amount of money if you get B true. So that principle is true, and it's consistent with this description of the case. But that principle, I think, is incompatible with principle R, and that's why you should reject principle R. Now, that argument isn't going to convince someone like Priest, but it does show that Priest's own argument, I think, doesn't appeal to sort of neutral ground. Moving on to the question of whether you think the Newcomb problem involves doing something impossible, or that involves you're rationally obligated to perform impossible. Of course, I don't think that, because I think what you're rationally obligated to do is to take the opaque box, and that's perfectly possible. That follows from the fact that people often do it.
Well, so what he would say is that, like, it's possible to do that, but we're saying that, like, rationality sort of requires of us that we do both, even though we can't.
Yes, that's correct. So I'd reject that claim that rationality requires you to do both. I mean, part of it, I guess, turns on the question of what rationality is supposed to mean anyway. I mean, if you come out with some sort of definition of rationality, the natural question to ask about that definition is, well, what's so good about being rational, if that's what you mean by rational? And I think I would say that about any version of rationality that satisfies the principle of R. So rationality itself is a kind of contested concept here, I think. And when, you can't just make an appeal to some commonly understood notion of practical rationality. That's part of the difficulty.
Yeah, that sounds right. So just another follow-up on that. When you say that, so on principle R, it goes something like, well, if some action entails a certain result that you get, I don't know, some amount of money, say, or some amount of value, and another action entails that you attain a greater amount of value, then you're obligated to perform that latter action, something like that. But the way he set it up here, where C sort of rigidly designates what's in the opaque box, doesn't it seem to follow that whatever that amount is, whatever that amount plus the $1,000 is going to be greater than just that amount? And are you just going to deny the principle, or is there something other issue with that?
Well, let's see now. I mean, if the claim is that necessarily what you get if you take from the opaque, what you get if you take both boxes is more than what you would have got if you'd taken just one box, that's true. But of course, that appeals to a kind of counterfactual way of interpreting the conditional, which won't impress anyone who's sort of a defender of evidentiary theory. If the claim is that there's a certain amount of money such that necessarily if you take one box, you'll get that, and then there's a small amount of money such that necessarily if you take the other box, you'll get that, and that's just not true, I think. If the claim is that, so then I'm not quite clear what the exactly what. So if the claim is necessarily if you take one box, you'll get C, and C is just a rigid designator. And necessarily if you take the other box, you'll get temporal C. And the principle is then, from those two, it follows that you ought to take the second box. That I don't see. I think with the plausibility of that comes from confusing it with the principle that necessarily if you do A, you'll do better than if you do B.
Yeah, and I guess there's also the concern that, well, you don't know beforehand what C rigidly designates or whatever. And an evidentialist might just say that, well, by choosing only the opaque box, I'll have good evidence that what C rigidly designates is $1 million, whereas that's not true on the other case.
Yeah, of course you don't know. So, but I think the way I put it is that if you the way of interpreting the principle that makes it very plausible is if you say necessarily if the material conditional, if you take one box you'll get a certain amount, and if you take another box you'll get less. And all of that sort of conjunction is necessary. But that's just not right, okay? Because there you're using material conditionals, and then it's just not true. If from the material conditional interpretation of the conditional, if you take one box, you'll get 1 million. But then if you'll take the other box, you'll get nothing. It's just as true. So that way of interpreting principle R, I think, would make it applicable, but it's never actually true. And then, just as you say, if we interpret it as a rigid designator, what the evidentialist is going to say is what we don't know, what quantity that rigid designator denotes in any case.
Great. So you mentioned counterfactuals and counterfactual reasoning and assessing counterfactuals is like a large issue and central issue in decision theory and Newcomb's problem in particular. So I was wondering what you think of a view about counterfactuals that I'm somewhat that I kind of like. So in a 2008 paper, Dorothy Edgington defends a view according to which conditional judgments should not be construed as factual categorical judgments, but as judgments about the consequent under the supposition of the antecedent. So it's like a suppositional view. She's somewhat modest in her conclusions, but do you think this is a good account of counterfactuals, or at least a first pass at this kind of counterfactual that might be most relevant to rational deliberation?
Yeah, I think there are various sort of problems with different ways of interpreting counterfactuals. One thing obviously is that you want counterfactual conditionals themselves to be positions, that is to say, to be sentences that can figure in more complicated logical contexts. So, for instance, you need to say things like, either if I turn left, I'd have ended up in town X, or if I turn right, I'd have got lost, or something like that. So you want to have disjunctions of counterfactuals, conjunctions of counterfactuals, and so on. And if you do that, then you're going to want to say that they are, in fact, actual categorical judgments, at least on the face of it, because you'd want them to have truth values. Having said that, I think it's reasonable to be Catholic about the kinds of things that people have called or could call counterfactuals. And maybe the right thing to say is that there's a whole different kinds of range of judgments and propositions and all of those things. Which one gets to be called counterfactual is kind of a matter of taste. It's just a semantic issue. And then the important question becomes whether the kind of conditional judgment that Edgington has identified is the right kind for featuring in rational deliberation. Now, there, I think there's a point where I agree with Edgington and a point where I disagree with Edgington. So the point where I agree is that, like her, like anyone who follows the sort of Jeffrey-style evidential theory, I do think that the kinds of conditionals, if you want to call them that figure in rational deliberation, are not themselves actual categorical judgments. They're rather conditional probabilities. And as we know from David Lewis's result, the conditional probability is not the probability of any proposition at all, so it isn't a judgment. On the other hand, exactly which judgment it is something on which I might differ from Edgington. So Edgington typically thinks of them in terms of conditional chances, where you hold fixed everything you assume everything that's causally independent of the consequent, of the antecedent. And of course, that results in something like causal decision theory, and I think therefore it gives the wrong answer in cases like Newcomb's problem. I suppose that's a long way of saying in some respects I agree with what she's saying, but in other respects I don't.
Great. So I'll move on to another question I had about concerning your paper, your 2018 paper on the why ain't you rich argument against the causalist response, or the two-boxing response. And one thing you discuss in there is different senses of opportunity subjects have in Newcomb's problem. They're sort of causal opportunities and evidential opportunities. And I was wondering what you think of the following sort of objection to the C opportunity view. So when we think of, subjective decision theories, they take only, the credences and the preference ordering and so forth of the subjects which face them. And the credences the subject has need not be true. And so a subject might face Newcomb's problem in the sense that they have the credences and preferences that specify the problem, even if those beliefs are not in fact true. So they may not have, in fact, any causal opportunities for money at all. Like suppose they're a brain in a vat, right? So if from that, if we're like partitioning by causal opportunities, causal decision theory will recommend differently to those with true Newcomb's problem beliefs and those with false Newcomb's problem beliefs. It'll be indifferent in the latter case since there's no opportunities, which is to say it recommends differently for the same decision problem. Do you think this is a fair criticism, or might the causalists say that it's the credences regarding causal opportunities that matter, not necessarily actual causal opportunities?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think the first thing I'd say is that as it's standardly formalized, causal decision theory does take subjective probabilities and preferences as its inputs. So you have your beliefs about the causal dependencies. In Lewis's version of it, you have beliefs about the causal dependency hypotheses, and of course you also have a utility function over outcomes. And the recommendation that CDT makes, as standardly understood, will supervene on those things. So that, as it's standardly understood, the causalist will say, or ought to say, that its credences regarding C opportunities, as you put it, rather than actual C opportunities, that matter. Now, of course, that's fine, but then the question returns. Then we return to the why aren't you rich argument, because in the why aren't you rich argument, it looks like the defense against the why aren't you rich argument is supposed to involve partitioning by actual opportunities, not by believed C opportunities. Right. So I think there's a kind of disjunction, there's a kind of difficulty there. But I think the way the causalist would respond and the way it would respond is the way I suggested. But you're right that there is a difficulty there.
Makes sense. Yeah, and you would criticize their further response in that regard. So let's see. I had a few questions concerning the sort of perfect or infallible or inerrant predictor case. I guess some people differentiate those. So several authors, like I include Lewis, Fisher, Heels, Sobel, I think Gibbard and Harper, who've written on the problem, maintain that two boxing is rational, even in the inerrant predictor case. Some of them will not say that it's rational in the infallible predictor case, but I think those people would say that it's rational even in the, at least in the inerrant predictor case. What do you think of this response, and why do you think that it has some sort of representation in the literature?
Yeah, so can we just go over the definitions here? So by an inerrant predictor, do you mean one who isn't possibly wrong? So who's right?
No. So I'm including one that's always correct in the actual world, but I guess not infallible in that, that they're necessarily correct in their predictions.
Okay. So there's the predictor who is certainly correct, 100% actually correct, but might have got things wrong in other possible gets things wrong in other possible worlds. Is that?
Yeah, that's the one I'm considering as the inerrant one.
Okay. So in that sense, yeah, because the terminology is a little bit confusing. Some people call that inerrant, some people call it infallible, and so it's kind of. But as long as we stick with one kind of term, it doesn't matter. Okay. So the predictor who's inerrant in your sense, that is one that we know they're going to get it right. I did have an argument in a paper from about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, where I argued that you can't consistently recommend that you should unbox against that person, but 2-box against an errant predictor. That is one who sometimes gets it wrong, or who you're not certain has got it right. And so from that, so from that perspective, I'm kind of inclined to agree with people like Joyce and Sobel and so on, who do take the view that even against the errant predictor, as you've described it, you should still be taking both boxes if you're a causal decision theorist. Because after all, the arguments for 2-boxing still go through, right? I mean, just think about the argument that you mentioned at the very start about, isn't it a good idea to take all the money in the room? None of the premises of that argument entail that the predictor gets things wrong ever. They're consistent with the predictor getting things right at all times. So that argument would lead you to take 2-boxing. If you accepted that argument at all, I think you should take both boxes, even in the case, more fantastical case. In some ways, it's a slightly less useful case, but of course, it's good to think about these vivid examples. In that case, I think causal decision theory would indeed support, and I think it should support, taking both boxes against that predictor. I think that's really implausible, intuitively implausible, but other people's intuitions might go the other way, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. Do you think, I'm kind of struggling to see what the relevant distinction is between like these sorts of predictors, the one that gets it right in all cases, but doesn't necessarily get it right, and the one which necessarily gets it right. I mean, does it? I struggle to see why that would make a difference for sort of the actual deliberation that the subject goes through. They know that the predictor will have gotten it right. I don't see why that there's some other possible world that's not, in which they get it wrong would be pertinent to that deliberation.
I totally agree. I mean, that's basically the evidentialist intuition, right? That's what drives the evidential decision theory. So if you think about what causal decision theory is about basing your decisions on causal or counterfactual connections. Now, what are causal or counterfactual connections? Well, unless you're David Hume, you just think, well, I think in some ways he was right, but most people now think of causation as meaning more than just actual patterns in the actual world. I mean, I think that's all it can be, but most people think it doesn't just depend on what's going on in the actual world, it depends on patterns that exist in other possible worlds as well. Therefore, whether there's a causal connection between what you do and what happens, it doesn't just depend on what actually happens, it depends on what happens in other nearby possible worlds or other situations that are not actual, even if you know that they're not actual. Since that's what causality depends on this view, decision according to causal decision theory has got to be sensitive to it. So it's got to be sensitive to what happens in other nearby possible worlds, not just in the actual world. And therefore, if you're up against a predictor who not only gets things right for certain in the actual world, who gets things right in every possible world, or in all nearby possible worlds, then according to causal decision theory, whether you 1-box or 2-box, in the relevant sense, makes a difference to what's in the boxes. So in that situation, causal decision theory would say that you should 1-box, even though against a contingently inerrant, as you put it, predictor, causal decision theory says you should 2-box. But I totally agree with your intuition that there's something wrong with caring about what happens. Now, I want actual money. I don't want counterfactual money. I don't care whether I'm doing better than some counterfactual person. What I want is the actual million. And there's a tried and tested way for getting the actual million, and that's the one that EDT and only EDT recommends.
It makes sense to me. So one more question related to the sort of perfect predictor case. So you may be familiar with the paper from 1985 from Don Hubin and Glenn Ross, who argue that that variant of the problem is defective. And their case relies, I take it, on the premise that a decision situation must be one in which there's at least one state of the world which has more than one action compatible with it. And they say that, well, in the perfect predictor case, that's not true, given that one state of the world, each state of the world regarding the prediction is compatible only with one action, and that you'll only have one action that will proceed from that. What do you think of this principle?
Yeah, I think the principle is false. So I think that there is such a thing. One can certainly deliberate about what to do in a situation where, for instance, supposing you're a compatibilist and you're a determinist, right? And you think there's only one possible development of history. You can still do something worth calling deliberation, I think, precisely because you don't know what you're going to do. And deliberation is, in effect, a fancy way of finding out what you're going to do. Obviously, the kind of procedures by which you find out what you're going to do, not like the procedures by which other people find out what you're going to do. The procedure by which you find out what you're going to do is a procedure we call deliberation, right? But it's still a way of finding out what you're going to do on the basis of your preferences, and finding out what you're going to do after being in a state of ignorance about it, and then deliberating about it. It's consistent with thinking that there's only one thing. Whatever you do, in fact, you could never have not done that. Or at least it seems to me that it is if you're a compatibilist, and as I guess I am, and you think that therefore choice, in the sense that decision theory should be concerned with, is perfectly compatible with there only being one possible course of history.
Right. So the idea is that what's relevant for like the decision theory and genuine deliberation is not that there's one state. In fact, at least two actions like consistent with the same state of the world, but that there's at least two actions that are open to you epistemically or something like that.
In the sense, as far as you know, yeah, that's right. I mean, I should maybe say one other thing about this, is that it does, in my own view, it does have slightly odd consequences. So I think there's a reasonable way of thinking about causality, according to which, on this view, you do have a very limited kind of, I mean, we all do, in fact, have limited kind of causal control over the past. So this is the way Hugh Price thinks about it, for instance. So he thinks that actually, in a deterministic situation, what I'm choosing between, when I choose now between snapping my fingers or not, I'm actually choosing between the situation, I actually have control over whether the world is one in which the initial conditions of the universe were such and such, or whether they were in some very slightly different situation. Because that's one of the things that will be, only one of those will be consistent with whatever I do. So you can, I'm not sure I believe in that as an interpretation of causation, but just as an illustration of how you can think the existence of only one possible course of history is compatible with free decision, is that you can take the view that even the past, as well as the future, is subject to your current control in that rather subtle way.
Yeah, but I think there is something to that sort of intuition. Like, it seems problematic to maintain that, well, we have some control over the action we're now taking, right? We're genuinely deliberating. But at the same time, we should ignore, the states in the past which are correlated or dependent on what choice we make now. But we can't ever include those in like considerations of which past events are correlated with which actions we take now. And we can't include that in our deliberation. I think, and a lot of causalists will want to deny that any such reasoning.
Yeah, I think so. So, and if you think about sort of why it even is in the first place that we think we've got causal control over the future but not the past. I mean, my suspicion is that's got something to do with facts about statistical thermodynamics together with the past hypothesis. You hypothesize a very low entropy past, and you sort of work on the basis of the sorts of facts about statistical mechanics that Boltzmann was highlighting. Then you can see that compatible with your own present choices, there's a very large variety of possible futures, but there is a small variety, but still a variety possible pasts. That sort of reductive explanation of the direction of time, I think, can cast some light on why it looks as though only the future, but not the past, is causally dependent on our choices. But that way of describing things is, I think, still optional. And the causal decision theorist, could be open to that. And that's something that Hugh Price thinks, as I said, for instance.
Right. So we would include, because we know a lot more about the past, and there's a lot of records about the past, we would include more of those facts in what I think Price used the term like fixtures and stuff like that when talking about our decision theory. But it's sort of like perhaps a unwarranted leap from there to include everything in the past as a sort of fixture.
Absolutely.
When in fact, yeah.
But even there, the issue about whether our records of the past are reliable or not, that depends on. If you just think about Boltzmann's H theorem, we're H theorem. We're in a state. If you don't make any assumptions about the past, the most likely thing about the present is that we're presently at the state of minimum entropy, right? And therefore, entropy rises in the future as you go towards the past as well as towards the future. And on that way of thinking about things, most of our records of the past are in fact misleading. What makes us think that our records are not misleading and that the past is kind of fixed is this assumption that the initial state was constrained in certain very tight ways to be very low entropy, for instance. And it's that sort of assumption that seems to be doing a lot of work, I think. This is not to disagree with you. I guess this is just to say a bit more about how sort of strange and fragile the whole situation seems to me without something like this assumption, this strong assumption about the past.
Right. Just a sort of related question. Do you think there's in the philosophy of time, you're saying things that a lot of, maybe if you're familiar with the debates in philosophy of time, like say B theory and A theory, do you have a view, or do you think that those theories are relevant to these sort of considerations?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure to what extent. I think you could probably take independent views of the sort of A theory, B theory dispute and dispute. But having said that, I kind of find it. I often find it quite hard even to understand that debate. So, for instance, the people who say that presentism, for instance, is the view that only the present exists, to which the answer is well, exists is a tensed verb, then of course only the present exists. Right. If exists is tenseless, then it's obviously false. So it seems to me I sometimes have a hard time understanding what the whole issue is about there. On McTaggart's, the argument itself by McTaggart, for instance, against the reality of the A series, I think I have some reservations about that. So although I think believing the A theory is probably consistent, I don't think there's any scientific reason to accept it.
Fair enough. So I had another question related to, in a previous response, you mentioned, I think you referred to your paper, Infallibility and Newcomb's Problem, or you provide an argument against the
that was
continuous strategy.
Yeah.
I just had a question about that. So you seem to agree with some authors that an infallible predictor might in fact be impossible, metaphysically, I guess. However, even if it turns out that such a thing is not in fact possible, what matters, as far as I can tell, is that the subject believes that it's actual, and the subject can coherently believe so, as far as I can tell. So whether it's in fact metaphysically possible, is that even really relevant to assessing Newcomb's problem?
Yeah, you're right. It may not be. If you think about decision theory, and the whole issue about decision theory is to do with choice between two subjective theories. So decision theory, at least subjective decision theory, is about what it's rational to do given what you think and want. And so all that should matter is the inputs for that is what you think and want, even if as a matter of fact your beliefs are mistaken, and perhaps not even possibly true. So what matters for this dispute, I guess, in any case, it's a somewhat abstruse dispute because I don't think there ever will be or has been infallible. So by infallible, do you mean one who always gets it right or one who's necessarily right?
I think this discussion was about one that's necessarily right, but
yeah, got it. Yeah, so I guess I suppose it was an issue. If you're a theist, it probably is a big issue. And that kind of illustrates your point quite well, because of course, something that will seem to them like a real problem will arise for the theist if they think that God is an infallible predictor in that sense. So think about the problems that arose for Calvinists, for instance, when they're thinking about how to behave and they believe in predestination. And they believe that predestination was infallible. They believe that. What should they do? Well, that's an interesting question. It may be causal decision theory does recommend one boxing. But what matters for the purposes of this bit of the discussion is that it was a real problem to which you could expect decision theory to give an answer, even if, as a matter of fact, as I believe, they were mistaken about that.
Right, and of course, like Bill Craig and James Horner, maybe others have considered sort of a theistic version of the problem, and I mean, they might believe that they in fact face that problem, even if they don't.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually, for once, I agree with Bill Craig on that particular point and what roughly his response to it. So yeah, no, I think one boxing is the way to go, definitely in that case.
So I had a question about the deliberation and prediction issue. So like you've discussed, and others of course have discussed, that sort of deliberation clouds out prediction thesis, and that you can't genuinely deliberate when you have some prediction over the outcome, or maybe we can specify it more precisely. But however, it seems to me that there are plenty of cases in which I might modestly predict my future actions, that yet still engage in genuine deliberation. For example, I think I'll probably have soup for dinner today, but I might still deliberate over that action. What do you think about these cases and the thesis more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally skeptical about the deliberation crowds out prediction thesis. So I think, like you, that there are going to be cases where you can certainly make predictions about what you're going to end up doing, even whilst you're deliberating about it. So if you think about examples like the one you described, and just cases where, supposing I'm just deliberating about whether I'm going to go on holiday, and I know I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about this, and then whether I'm going to go on holiday in a couple of weeks' time, let's say, and then I get an offer to buy insurance for my holiday trip, at a special rate. But it's a time-limited offer. I've got to decide in the next 5 minutes. Now, whether I buy the insurance or not is going to depend on a prediction about how this other part of my deliberation is going to terminate. And so, in a sense, I do have to have some sort of prediction about the upshot of that deliberation. Somebody might turn around and say, yeah, but when you're deliberating about whether to buy the insurance, you stop deliberating about whether to go on a holiday. But then I'd say, in actual fact, in real cases, the boundaries between times when you're actually deliberating and the times when you're not deliberating about something seem to me to be vague and ill-defined. And there's a precise activity that can count as deliberate. And what actually happens in deliberation? You think about some of the pros of something, you think about some of the cons of it. You might do some kind of risk-benefit analysis or something, and then you just go for one of them or the other. One of those processes, I think, can go on perfectly consistently with some kind of belief about what the upshot is going to look like. Another example, which is from the Bible, was Saint Peter. Okay, so Saint Peter, Jesus, as you know, said to him, "You'll betray me," and because it was Jesus who said to him, he had a perfectly reasonable belief that that's what he was going to do. That belief was consistent with his deliberating about what to say when the Roman guards asked him if he knew this person. So not that he betray him, but that he would deny him. The Roman guards asked him whether he knew him, and he said no, he didn't. And whilst deliberating about that, he could also believe that ultimately he would betray Jesus. So that's another example, more a peculiar example, but it's another example of a case where I think it's the best description of what's going on is that it's a case where you're making some kind of, as you put it, modest prediction about your future actions, but still engage in something that is worth calling deliberation, unless you've already got some kind of axe to grind about it. So yeah, I guess I do agree with you on that. Yeah.
So, how would we apply that to forget which paper. I guess it's the paper on Arzenius's Yankees problem, where you discuss that. I forget what the paper is called that you wrote, but I think it's one of the things you appeal to in response to that problem.
That's right. So that was a paper that I wrote with Hugh Price. And the way it worked was that he wrote the bit, he wrote his bit, and I wrote my bit, and then we kind of stuck them together. But I don't remember whether I did then, but I don't think now I would endorse the sort of rejection of the endorsement of the deliberation crowds out prediction stuff. So my own view about that is that the best response to Arzenius is that it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about Wine to Rich. So when we work out what the Wine to Rich argument is supposed to be doing, we have to look at the statistics in a suitably disaggregated way. And we have to look at cases which match your case with regards to what you believe about the situation that you're in. And when we do that in the sort of Red Sox example that Arzenius discusses, the Yankees and Red Sox example that he discusses in that paper, we'll find that actually we disaggregate the problem into two cases. And in both of those cases, evidential decision theory does better than causal decision theory. So that would be my own, that sort of more sort of statistical Simpson's paradox type approach would be my own favorite response to the Arzenius problem rather than Hugh's response, which, as you say, tends to rely more on this deliberation crowding out prediction assumption.
Fair enough. Is there a sense in which deliberation might crowd out prediction in that you could have a betting strategy that would be inconsistent with your beliefs about the outcomes? So, for example, without specifying the whole problem again, you might think that, well, every time I'm told that my next bet will win, I'll bet on the Red Sox. And every time I'm told that my next bet will win, I'll bet on the Yankees. Now, assuming that what's said to you is correct, the Red Sox will win every game. But that's not correct given what you're told about the actual outcomes of the season. So you take yourself to be able to perform something, or have at least a betting strategy, a sequence of bets that's inconsistent with some of your other beliefs. Is that a potential case where there's some tension between your prediction and your deliberation?
Yeah, I mean, there could be, yes, that's right. So there's a case, so there might be some cases where your prediction and your deliberation in tension, that's absolutely right. And that could happen. And that's, in fact, the case, as you described, seems to fit it. I guess, so if by deliberation crowds out predictions, you mean that can happen, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I don't think, even on the stronger interpretation of it, I don't think it's a major threat to the evidential theory, but I think for independent reasons, I'm not sure I believe it. Having said that, we do interpret typically, so people like Price, for instance, do think of, or Hayek, who opposes it, think of deliberation crowds out prediction as a thesis that there's something inevitable, there's something about the nature of deliberation that inevitably means you can't also predict something. So if you think about it in terms of, the work goes back to Kant, this whole idea that you can look at yourself in two different ways, from two perspectives, from the perspective of agent, of someone who's acting and doing things, and from the perspective of a spectator, where you wonder what's going to happen and how your life is going to unfold, so on. And my own perspective is not dualistic in that way. My own perspective is sort of monistic, which is to say that there's only, the best way of thinking about our lives is from a single perspective, and that actually even deliberation is not some radically new way of looking at your life. It's just another special kind of way of finding out how things will happen. It's not something inconsistent with other forms of predictive activity. So I don't think there's some inevitable clash between deliberation and prediction, because I don't think that they represent two different perspectives one couldn't occupy simultaneously. But that's consistent with saying, indeed in the case that you describe, I think I'd agree, that some particular cases of deliberation might crowd out some particular predictive patterns. Yeah.
Makes sense. So I had another question related to a paper that Timothy Williamson wrote in 2019 defending causal decision theory against the psychopath button thought experiment. And he says something like, it is not true that almost everyone in your pool, that is those facing the problem who have your initial credences, who push make a mistake in pushing. This follows straight from the fact that most people in your pool are not psychopaths. Only a small percentage of those receiving evidence for psychopathy can actually be psychopaths. But however, the probability that you're not a psychopath, given that you push, is very low, sort of by stipulation, even for people with your initial credences. So doesn't it just follow that those from your pool who receive evidence for psychopathy just are likely to be psychopaths? So that the evidence really is not, in fact, misleading, as Williamson suggests?
I suppose so. In the case, I can't remember exactly how he described it. I mean, is it a case where all the people with your evidence, your initial evidence, most of them end up pushing? Is that right?
No, I think it's that most of them are not, in fact, psychopaths. I don't think he says... and the question is whether those in that pool who receive evidence for psychopathy, i.e. from the fact that they push, are in fact correct, and what we can generalize to your case.
I see, got it, yeah. So I think, I mean, in some ways I do have some sympathy with that. That is to say, I don't think, I think that from the perspective of causal decision theory, you can indeed defend the strategy of pushing the button. And I think the sensible thing for causal decision theory says that you should press the button, because after all, you're almost certainly not a psychopath, and therefore almost certainly pushing the button is going to lead to the best outcome. Now, the way you put it is that, given that you push, the probability that you're not a psychopath is very low. So once you pushed, even for people with your initial credences, that's correct. So those who push are likely to be psychopaths. Now, does it follow that the evidence is not in fact misleading? Well, the evidence is misleading for the people who push, okay? Because the people who push have evidence that they're not going to push, right? Because you're in a pool where most people are not psychopaths. So you're in a pool where almost nobody pushes, right? You know that. So your evidence about what you're in fact going to do, I guess, in that example, is misleading if you do in fact don't push. The evidence as a whole is not misleading. It's misleading for the people who push. It's not misleading for the people who don't push. And I assume the people who don't push the majority. So in one sense, it's misleading, and in the other sense, it isn't. And I think I'd agree with you that in fact, the fairer thing to say is that the evidence isn't misleading, because by pushing, you're putting yourself in a much smaller group than the group that you initially were in. Having said that, I do think you can defend. I think the best thing for causal decision theory in this example, in the psychopath button example, is to say, yes, you should go ahead and push, because you're almost certainly not a psychopath, so you're almost certainly going to get the best outcome.
When you say that that for those who do push, the evidence is misleading, you're talking about the sort of initial evidence that they're probably not a psychopath?
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
But the evidence that's not misleading in favor of psychopathy would be them pushing the button. That's going to be good evidence.
Yeah, exactly. So what it is, initially, everyone's getting evidence that they're probably not going to push and they're probably not a psychopath, okay, in this pool. And that evidence isn't really misleading, because indeed most people won't push. The people who do, initial evidence was, I suppose, misleading in a sense, but then of course once they pushed, they've got new evidence which is going to guide them in the right direction. I don't think it's fair to complain against this case. The evidence is misleading, or at least it doesn't seem to me to be a strong objection on behalf of causal decision theory. The evidence is misleading, but I think causal decision theory should just say, as I said, the right thing about this case is that you should push. But I think there's also an argument that if you don't push in the psychopath button, then you've got to, if you don't push in the psychopath button, but you do two box in Newcomb's problem, then you end up with a kind of incoherence. So I think rationally, you have to push in the psychopath button if you're a two boxer in Newcomb's problem.
So isn't there a way to sort of frame those as basically the same decision problem?
So there's a way to frame them so that they're variants of one another in such a way that if you don't push in the psychopath button but do two box in Newcomb's problem, then you end up violating the transitivity of preference. So I don't think it's consistent it's not consistent to take both of those routes. So I think, not only should they have to say, and I think Williamson does take that view in the end. About the psychopath button case.
I had another question, not one that I wrote down, but on, I think in your book, what was it called? Causation, Evidence, and Decision, something like that. You discussed a lot of these issues and a lot of related decision problems, including the smoking lesion one. And in that one, I recall you defending a sort of tickle defense in favor of smoking, right? Can you sort of, because this is something I've never quite. So I agree that there are going to be cases where there's some evidence that you have that will screen off new evidence related to your choice, but it's not clear to me that this case is going to be one of those. Could you sort of elaborate on this response?
Yeah. And I guess the way I would put it now is that the sort of standard smoking lesion version of the Newcomb problem is kind of underdescribed, and it sort of depends on how you think about these cases. I think on any reasonably realistic version of the case where it's about smoking, I think evidential decision. I think there is a reasonable tickle defense, and I think evidential decision theory would endorse smoking. So what we're thinking about is a case where the way in which tendency to smoke manifests itself is through some kind of impulse, right? That's typically how these things actually work. It's through some kind of impulse. In this particular case, because of the increase in certain kinds of receptors in your brain, the nicotine receptors in your brain, and that creates certain impulses. And smokers are very aware of those sorts of impulses, and those are the things that give them an urge to smoke. So once you're aware of those, smoking itself is isn't evidence of a lesion any more than it's evidence that you smoked in the past. So I think in those cases, if we're going to be realistic about things that actually happen to real people, I don't think most real people would be sensible to take their current smoking activity as evidence about the past, evidence of any underlying condition that causes their impulses to smoke, or anything else that might be used in a Newcomb type. Those are the sorts of very realistic versions which people actually face. And then you can complicate them in various ways, involving various other kinds of causal routes. For instance, Sabella has examples, I think the popcorn problem and various other sorts of problems. As those cases become more complicated, I think there's a kind of spectrum of sort of super realistic everyday cases, all the way to the kinds of totally wacky, infallible, as you call it, predictor cases. And at some point on that spectrum, the tickle defense is going to stop, something like a tickle defense is going to stop being available. And that's the point at which evidential decision theory switches from recommending smoking to not recommending smoking. The whole question is how much we should trust our intuitions, and indeed how strong our intuitions are about these cases, which are, I suspect, typically not very realistic. One kind of exception that I discussed in that book, which I think plausibly is a realistic version of Newcomb's problem, is the case involving prisoner's dilemma when, for instance, you're voting in a large election. Those, it seems to me, could very well be real Newcomb problems in which your choices are evidence for what people will do, but they're not fully responsible. Right. So that's a case where you could get something like this in a smoking lesion case where the tickle defense possibly isn't available. But in the versions that actually, in anything like a version that people actually ever face, I think the tickle defense is a reasonable response.
That's actually really helpful. Yeah, I think seems all right to me.
You're right. I mean, I agree with you that. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, because I worried about the applicability of a tickle style defense in the case where, well, you're not going to expect that, or at least you don't expect the causal pathway through, your desires or something that you would have evidence for prior to your decision.
That's right. I mean, there are cases where it doesn't go through your desires at all. There you might wonder whether it's even a matter of choice or whether it's something that's up to you at all. If it's something like just a tick, it's a sensible question to ask whether it's a decision at all. Of course, then it will be a sign of the past. It's not that anything you've done is a sign of the past. And then there are sort of other sort of more complicated cases. Part of it will depend, I guess, also on whether the route goes through whether you're sympathetic to the evidential theory or not. That's going to make a difference too. But then you get, you do get complications, and and there's nothing wrong with complicated cases, but we just ought to be careful about our intuitions about those cases because they're not cases that we face every day, and in fact, not cases we face ever, really.
You mentioned that there's, in looking at these cases, there's sort of a spectrum, and there's going to be cases where a tickle style defense is clearly applicable, and cases in which it's not. Is there some, but in the gray area in between, is it? How is evidential decision theory to handle those cases?
Yeah, and I think you just have to look at it case by case. So you'd have to ask, in some cases, it seems that it all depends on whether the choice ultimately is evidence for the prior state or not. If the choice is evidence for the prior state, then evidential decision theory will say that you ought to one box. If not, then it will say you ought not. And that ultimately depends on your own subjective state. That's a subjective matter, but we can say of any particular case, I think, how familiar it is, roughly how likely it is to arise in real life, and so why we should care about it, and so on. I think, as I say, some of the interesting cases are cases where, the sorts of cases that Lewis talks about. So when you have prisoner's dilemma with someone who's very like you, cases like that. I also think perhaps, and I've got a book coming out where I discuss this, cases where you think that your own choices, present choices, are evidence for your future choices. So if you think about things like addiction and so on, you might think, should I take this drug today or should I smoke today? I mean, it all depends on the mechanism of the addiction, but there are at least some kinds of cases where you might think that what you do today, when you give into a certain kind of temptation, is an indicator of your tastes or an indicator of your weaknesses or your ability to give in to temptation or to withstand it. Therefore, you might think that it's a sign, though it does nothing to cause, your resistance to temptation in the future. And so you might think that by abstaining today, that's a sign that I'm going to abstain in the future. So that's the reason why I ought to do it. Even in a case where, say it's just one drink or one cigarette or something like that. Cigarettes is a bad example, but maybe drink. You might, and one drink isn't going to make a difference, but lots and lots of drinks over the next, 10 years will make a difference. So that would be a case where evidential decision theory does function as a mechanism for self-control, because controlling yourself now is a sign that it doesn't cause you to control yourself in the future. So that's an example, I think, where you can get interesting Newcomb-style cases that actually bear some relation to problems people actually face in reality. And EDT does recommend the one-boxing option in some of those cases, I suspect.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, a concern that some people often have is that, well, okay, these decision problems might be interesting in their own right, but most of them are quite fantastic and probably not something that we'd ever face. But that sort of example, I guess voting ones and maybe some others are quite relevant to everyday life. Is that what you say?
I mean, I think there are very specific. I mean, that's one reason why we shouldn't be too impressed by Newcomb's problem by itself as a way of showing that evidential decision theory is false, because someone quite, as Jeffrey said, these are problems for space cadets, a lot of them, because they never actually arise. It doesn't matter. But Lewis was right to point out that there could be actual cases. And in fact, prisoner's dilemma, of course, is something that happens everywhere. So insofar as prisoner's dilemma approximates Newcomb's problem, There are going to be cases like that everywhere. And another sort of example that I came across were cases that anthropologists study, and indeed cases that people have studied in other connections to do with randomization. Okay, so standard Bayesian decision theory says you should never randomize, but there are times when it's actually a good idea to randomize according to the evidential theory. And one sort of case is where you suspect that there's some kind of common causal mechanism or some kind of bias or something like that would push you in one direction and would also push your opponent in the same direction. So just to go into that in a little bit more detail, there were studies by anthropologists in the 1950s, and not that many, but a few some decades later, looking into the phenomenon of augury. Augury is the practice where what you do is you look at the behavior of random things, for instance, birds, how many birds you can see at a certain time. You make important decisions on the basis of that. And the reason that it matters is that it can seem to be pointless or unmotivated unless you think that, for instance, there's a correlation between what you do and what a predator does, for instance, or what somebody who's, someone you want to avoid is doing. So if your decision about where to go, supposing you're hunting something, and there's a correlation between where you go and some evolved correlation between where you go and where your prey goes. So typically, if you choose in a random direction, what seems random to you, your prey typically goes in the opposite direction. By using a genuine random thing like augury, you're actually randomizing your decisions so as to remove any such bias. That's something that evidential decision theory can support, even though causal decision theory doesn't. So it can help to explain why people went in for practices like augury and made big decisions on the basis of apparently random things. Something similar happens even in modern contexts when you think about Fisher's justification. So R.A. Fisher's justification for using randomized trials and experimentation. Justification for that is supposed to be, or one of the justifications is supposed to be that thereby you avoid unconscious biases in certain directions. And what you're thinking about is causes of your choice, might have side effects that interfere with the result of the experiment. And that's why you introduce explicitly randomizing factors like tossing coins and other such things. Again, that's not quite a Newcomb problem, but it is a case where evidential decision theory makes that recommendation, the causal theory doesn't. So that's another sort of case which is very common in real life, or was very common in the lives of various parts of human history, where I think it can cast some light. Sorry, I went on for a while, but those were examples that I find interesting.
No, I mean, that's great. And I think in that, in the predator-prey example, that it seems almost obvious to me that sort of consideration would be right. I mean, if you want to make it less likely that your prey will avoid you, given that there's probably some common cause to your how you would normally proceed and how they would run away, acting in a way that's going to break that causal chain, and really by randomizing your action could only help, right?
But it was interesting because for centuries, nobody knew why anyone went in for augury, right? No one knew why people went, But for so long, it persisted in so many parts of the world, and it still does to some extent, that people base decisions on coin tosses, astrology, random processes of various sorts. Why bother doing that? Why even pay costs to do that? So it does seem obvious when you say it, but it was actually, I think, quite an important insight somebody had in the 50s that's the reason why people do it. But the other point, what's of interest to me, in addition, as you say, is that if the reasoning behind that is that there's a common cause to your apparently random choices and those of your prey, the evidential decision theory can rationalize that sort of choice, but the causal theory can't. So it's an interesting argument for the applicability of evidential decision theory, I guess.
I kind of wonder somewhat speculatively if there's potential sort of historical evolutionary explanation from those sort of procedures that our ancestors might have taken to some of the beliefs that people have today, like maybe as it relates to astrology and other things like that. That's kind of so speculative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It might have something to do it. It might have something to do with it. I mean, certainly there are cases where you could imagine certainly wanting to take random choices, and there are cases where it would be an advantage actually to have these beliefs, so that you don't have to keep thinking about when you should and when you shouldn't make choices on the basis of something random. So you could imagine that. On the other hand, of course, there are all kinds of other reasons why people might believe in astrology, like wishful thinking and wanted to have some kind of illusion of control and various other things. So there's all kinds of reasons for that. But I think it's probably not far-fetched to think that it probably plays some role in at least some cases. Yeah.
All right. So I'll move on to another question. Let's see. Yeah. So let's see. Yeah. So there's a paper from, maybe I'm not pronouncing this right, Volpert and Befford in 2013. One of the things I mentioned sort of as an aside is, well, they think that the temporal ordering, right, between the decision and the prediction is somewhat irrelevant to the statement of the problem. So they say something like the temporal invariance means that both the formal statement of the paradox and its resolution are unchanged if the prediction occurs after your choice rather than, as is conventional, before your choice. This is an interesting point, but one which I'm not sure causalists should accept. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I suppose if you say the prediction occurs after your choice, I don't think it needs to upset the structure of Newcomb's problem. You're referring to Newcomb's problem, is that right?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I should have been clear.
Sure, I don't think it upsets the structure of Newcomb's problem, just so long as the causal structure remains the same. That is to say, you can have something occurring after your choice, which is still causally independent of your choice, but has a common cause. So just to give an example, suppose that, for instance, there is a brain scan that's taken of me just before I make my choice. The brain scan later, much later, I leave. The brain scan is left lying around, and the predictor, as you call them in inverted commas, as you would now call them in inverted commas, sees the brain scan and then makes a judgment as to what choice I made, and then rewards or punishes me accordingly. That would be a case where it wasn't my choice, my actual decision, my actual physical movement that caused this person to reward or punish me. It was rather the brain scan that was a common cause of both my physical movement, the brain state that was a common cause of both my physical movement and that person's prediction. But it could still be a case in which the prediction, as you might call it, or retrodiction would be a better word, occurs subsequently the choice. So in that case, the causalist would still have his usual assessment of the counterfactuals. He would still say, if I'd chosen otherwise, the brain scan would still have been the same. So if I'd chosen otherwise, the predictor, as you might call him, would still have done the same. So it would still in that case endorse two-boxing. But I think it makes it a bit more confusing. I mean, part of what's so vivid and what's so good about the original Nozick style presentation of the problem is that precisely because the prediction takes place in advance of your choice, you're much less inclined to think of it as a case involving some kind of nefarious causal influence. Whereas in a case like that, maybe you'd be subject to that illusion. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't think we're forced to regard a prediction as occurring prior to the choice. But it is a much more natural way of describing the case.
What if we, in this variation, we just deny that it's based on anything in the past, right? So something like the brain scan, which would entail or make likely whatever, a certain prediction or retrodiction and choice. And so that, well, the only things we're affirming here is that you make some choice at some time, say to take only one box. And then subsequent to that, the predictor or retrodictor places the money in there, at least most of the time. and is not based on anything that's fixed prior to your choice. Wouldn't the couldn't the causalists agree to sort of the evidentialist assessment of the counterfactuals here, even if the causal structure is the same?
Good. So, I mean, I guess if you say there's no common cause, then the causal structure is slightly different, because typically we do think there's a common cause. But if you say there's no common cause, so you have two events that are correlated, but there's no common cause, then the natural thing to say is that one of them causes the other. Typically, the earlier one causes the later one. That's right. I do think that's logically necessary, though. I mean, I think there are going to be cases where you can have events that are correlated, there's no common cause, and yet we don't even want to say that one of them causes the other. So those are the cases involving the EPR type correlations, right? So you can have, if you think about Bell's theorem and what it shows that you can have even space-like separated phenomena that are correlated, but there's no common cause. So because they're space-like separated, one of them doesn't cause the other. There is no common cause, and yet they're correlated. And I think cases like that can be exploited to give sort of, in one sense, realistic, in the sense that technically it's perfectly feasible, version of the not Newcomb's problem, but a version that evidential decision theory and causal decision theory disagree over, because it's a case where you have the key phenomenon, which is events that are correlated with your choice, but are not caused by your choice. I guess I'd agree with you that in typical cases, if you think there's no common cause, correlated events have to be causally related, and that would upset the counterfactual structure, just as you say. But I think that they can, not just logically, but in principle, practically even, there could be cases that exploit quantum correlations. You can have events that have no common cause, and yet they're correlated. One doesn't cause the other.
Yeah. So that's actually what I had in mind in this case, right? We're supposing that they're correlated, but they don't have a common cause, nor are they directly causally related. And then, so we're, I think, isn't it like Reichenbach's common cause principle? It's sort of a denial of that.
Exactly.
At least in this case. But speaking of, you brought up the EPR issues, correlations, and there's a paper I'm sure you're familiar with from Koberinsky, Dunlap, and Larper from 2017. And I sort of want to read a couple sentences from that and get your thoughts on that. They say, in short, what is relevant for causal decision theory is not the presence of causation in any metaphysically significant sense, but the presence of physical dependencies. Of course, cases where there is a causal connection between an action and an outcome will be cases where such dependencies exist. But one of the most fundamental lessons of quantum mechanics is that there are physical dependencies that exist in nature, which can be perfectly well described by your best physical theories, which may nonetheless be acausal. So what do you think of this point?
So I think the theory that they're describing isn't really properly described as causal decision theory. A better way to describe it would be what you might call nomological decision theory, where nomological decision theory just means a theory that respects physical dependencies in whatever causal direction they run. So on this view, there is a physical dependency in the sense that there's a law-like correlation, not just a correlation, but a law-like correlation, one that we can expect to, we're very confident will persist into the future, between your choice and what the predictor does, or specifically what happens at the two wings of the EPR setup. Now, that's fine, but then if you look at cases, if you look at Newcomb type cases where we exploit physical dependencies of that sort that are clearly not causal, this theory is going to recommend one boxing like the evidential theory. It's not going to recommend two boxing the way that Lewis's causal decision theory or Joyce's or most standard causal decision theories will. So that theory, I think, ends up being very much like evidential decision theory in this respect. And I think there may be other reasons to reject it, but I think that certainly it's not a defense of what most people think of the causal theory, if that means a theory that two boxes in Newcomb's problem in other cases for the sort of counterfactual-based reasons that we've talked about. So I don't think, I sort of persist in my view that, I think, to be fair to Harper, when he presented causal decision theory, I think physical dependence was really what he always had in mind. But most advocates of causal decision theory didn't mean that. They meant something more specific, which produces two-boxing and Newcomb's problem, even in cases where there's a nomological dependency, but not a causal dependency, which you knew what the predictor does.
Right. I mean, this is basically the issue I had with it, right? So if our causal decision theory is sensitive to acausal physical dependencies or acausal dependencies in general, then why wouldn't it also be sensitive to dependencies in between the prediction and the choice in Newcomb's problem, or the different subjects' actions in the prisoner's dilemma, or pressing the button, and so on? I kind of struggle to see how we could formulate causal decision theory that it produces the evidentialist response in the APR case, but the standard causalist response is elsewhere.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It actually goes a bit further than what I was saying, because in fact, if you're as Humean about it as you should be, I mean, what are laws of nature? What are physical responses? Physical dependencies? Well, they're just patterns. They're just patterns in what we observe. There is nothing makes anything happen. There are no laws in any other interesting sense in nature. There are just patterns in what we observe. And of course, in Newcomb's problem, in the psychopath pattern, in the smoking lesion, all of these cases, there are still patterns in what we observe. They may not be invariable, but they're statistical patterns. And it's just not clear. There's no principled reason that I can see why we should be more reluctant to rely on those statistical patterns than on the ones that we call, for some reason, laws. Causal laws.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to a couple of questions on the philosophy of religion. I have more questions here, but don't want to spend all the time on that. Dr. Norse was wondering what your general view is on problems of evil, both logical and evidential. Do you think they have significant weight in favor of atheism?
I think the evidential problem of natural evil does give us some reason to doubt the existence of God, as defined in the traditional way. So I think there's that. I think it's the case of natural evil is obviously especially compelling, and I do think of it as an evidential problem. But there may be other sorts of versions that are more powerful, but I've never had a good sort of response, plausible response to that. Now, of course, that in a way is going to depend on your priors, what sort of things you're willing to give up, and what sort of things you're willing to change. And of course, that's why it's an evidential problem. So, although I report that it does have some subjective weight with me, there may be other people that it's not going to convince, and that's fine too.
Do these sorts of arguments, is this a sort of argument that's sort of central to why you're an atheist after all? I think you've mentioned that your credence in theism is about as small as anything else, but non-zero. Could you sort of elaborate on what?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, one thing I want to say for a start is that, of course, I'm a subjective Bayesian, which means that ultimately there's no objective rationalization of anyone's bias. But I can report on the sorts of evidence the sort of experiences that have moved me, that have stopped me from moving in the theistic direction, which is basically the same as the evidence that stopped me moving in any other sort of belief in fantasy stories or other direction, which is that there seems to be zero evidence for it, practically no empirical evidence for any of these theses. There is maybe a little bit, but there's practically none. And of course, there's the existence of many religions which say incompatible things. That's another one. So religions seem to predict things which turn out to be false. They're incompatible with one another. There's a problem of evil. There's all the supernatural, all the reasons that I have for not believing in miracles, which are the foundation of many religions, which are the ones that Hume mentions. So those are the sorts of ultimately empirical reasons that I have for not believing it. But I should emphasize my reasons for not being theistic are empirical, or I would like to think they are anyway. To some extent, they're emotional as well. At least there's a part of the cause of it. But there's certainly a good deal of, I would hope, a good deal of responsiveness to empirical evidence there.
Great. Sort of a methodological question for people, and you mentioned that you're subjective Bayesian. For people who have very different priors regarding these matters, how do you go about, resolving the disputes that come up.
It's kind of interesting. Some disputes can't be resolved. So what would happen is if someone's got totally wildly enough different priors for me, then it's going to be difficult for me to resolve, pretty much anything I can say. It's not going to help them, and it's not going to help them change their mind. So there are going to be some disputes which simply can't be resolved. But of course, there are ways that, emotionally speaking and practically speaking, can often be much more effective in changing people's minds than just talking about religion. Those can be to do with just things like seeing how people live their lives. Living in a country where people, if you lived in a Scandinavian country or somewhere where people are just not religious, and you see something about what that involves and the kind of life that you're involved in, you can imagine people gradually detaching from their emotional attachment to these beliefs. And in practice, that can be what happens and can sometimes be more effective than straightforward arguments. Is just that sort of, not so much argument, but persuasion by example. So that's not something that you can just do very easily. That's one of the things that I guess can be effective and probably will be effective, for many people in the future. But I have to concede, in response to your initial question, that as a subjective Bayesian, if there are people whose priors are different enough from me, I'm not going to be able to convince them, and vice versa, I guess, as well. But that's just something you have to accept.
Yeah, fair enough. It seems that there's going to be some point at which no further progress can be made. Just to add one thing there. That's part of what's so great about the Humean argument, is that Hume's argument against miracles. Because Hume appeals to principles that he's reasonable to expect that everyone believes already. So why do we believe that history books or testimony tells us about the past at all? Because we believe in laws of nature. That very belief, the belief that we needed in the first place in order to find testimony of miracles plausible, that belief itself undermines belief in miracles. So he's appealing to an argument that he can reasonably expect. He's appealing to belief that he can reasonably expect most of his antagonists to have high freedom sin, and that's what makes the argument so powerful, I think. Speaking of your of Hume's argument against miracles, could you briefly describe your account of it in your, I think, 2015 paper on that matter?
Yeah. So the account of the argument itself is reasonably standard. That is to say, there have been sort of roughly Bayesian interpretations of Hume's argument around for a while. But to put it informally, you can think of it like this. And what Hume pointed out was that when you have testimony to, and it doesn't have to be a miracle, it could be any sufficiently unlikely event. When you have testimony to a sufficiently unlikely event, you have to ask yourself which of two things is more likely, that testimony is true, or that the person is either lying or made a mistake or whatever. And we know from experience that people do frequently. Even every theist has to accept this. People do frequently lie, make mistakes, misled, exaggerate, and so on. That happens a lot. Violations of laws of nature, on the other hand, happen very rarely, if at all. I want to emphasize that the way I understand the argument, they're not ruled out by definition. It isn't a very cheap argument that nothing by definition could violate a law of nature. We can allow that there might be violations of laws of nature. But even if we allow that there might be, it would be reasonable to have a prior in them which is very low. So when you ask yourself which is more likely in this particular case, that statement the person made was true, and therefore that a law of nature was broken, for instance, that a person rose into the air without visible support, without any support, or on the other hand, that the person is mistaken or exaggerating or has been misled or whatever. You should always conclude that the second is more likely, vastly more likely, and therefore you should never take testimony to a miracle to be serious grounds for believing that it happened.
But you don't want to rule it out that there might be some cases where the testimony just is compelling enough that you would find the thing more likely.
So I guess that was, in a way, that was the contribution that the paper was meant to make, was that there are certain kinds of cases which, Babbage, for instance, made this argument, Charles Babbage made this argument, other people have made it since then. You can think of cases where the testimony is so good actually you'd want to believe the testimony. And the kind of case that Babbage had in mind was the case where you have multiple independent witnesses. Okay, so if you think about independent witnesses at an event, even if each one is only reasonably reliable, they all agree and they're independent that a certain event took place, and the probability that they all got it wrong, if there are n witnesses, is going to be something like p to the power of n, where p is the probability that one of them got it wrong. So it's going to be vastly unlikely that they all got it wrong. And so if you multiply witnesses, if you even have 100 witnesses, probably they all got it wrong is tiny, perhaps even much smaller than probability of a violation of the law of nature. And so in that case, you would have such excellent evidence that actually, even from 100 independent witnesses, you have such excellent evidence that actually you want to believe that the miracle occurred. That case, so that was the argument, and the contribution of that paper was that actually such cases typically don't happen because we've misunderstood what's required by independence. What would happen in a case like that, if you had 100 people, all of whom had contact with one another, all of whom were isolated, they were in a very good situation to see what had happened, and they also know the miracle took place, you wouldn't think, oh, the miracle really happened. What you would think is you would just think it was a very powerful illusion that was capable of misleading all of these people at once. It's like you would think if a million people, independently saw an event on TV, that it was a miracle. You would think, well, it was a very good special effect or something like that. So the right thing to think about these cases is that although witness testimonies are causally independent, they're not evidentially independent, and that's what matters for the purposes of assessing their evidential status to a miracle. And that kind of case, so it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to have genuinely independent human witnesses to a miracle. And that's why the sorts of cases that Babbage describes really couldn't happen.
Right. But at the same time, there's going to be, at least in principle, could be some cases where the illusion hypothesis is itself more implausible than the truth of the miracle or something like that.
Sure, that's right. There could be. You think about a case like the miracle of Fatima. So there was a case in Spain. Was it in Spain in like 1920 or 1919? People saw, they seemed to see the sun going backwards in the sky and moving around in strange ways. And there would have been maybe 10,000 people who saw it. Nobody's going to think. Well, I don't think any sensible person will think that really was a case where we've got massive amounts of a miracle. One would think that was a situation where, for one reason, perhaps some atmospheric phenomenon or something like that, there was some common cause of everyone's suffering roughly the same sort of illusion. That would be a way to describe that case. But of course, you're right. You can't rule out a priori it could happen. And not just a priori, but the sort of way it could realistically happen would be when you have forms of evidence that are very diverse. Because when the forms of evidence are very diverse, the possibility of an illusion that sort of falsifies all of them is much more difficult. So if you have some type of physical evidence, photographic evidence, and you also have evidence from sonar, and then you also have evidence from an eyewitness, and then you have evidence from other independent causal processes, and quite distinct causal processes. Those are cases where you have really good evidence, and you're not going to say there you might want to say that a miracle occurred. So, you can't rule it out in principle. Of course not. You can say that sorts of cases where you have many human beings testify to something, or many other causally independent but qualitatively similar sources of evidence for a single event, those are cases where, in fact, there is no difficulty, I think, for the human argument.
Right. All right. I wanted to ask you about your assessment of problems from arguments from fine tuning, which go, something like, well, the likelihood that the parameters would be life permitting on given theism is not very low, but the likelihood of those parameters being life permitting on given naturalism or non-theism is extraordinarily low, and our priors on those theses are not as extreme as to make a difference, such that given the fact that the parameters are life permitting, we should prefer theistic hypothesis. What do you think of that sort of style of argument?
Yeah, so I guess I think, I mean, part of it, I suppose, is just my failure to understand why the prize should be distributed in that way. And there seems to be nothing natural about distributing the prize in that way. Because after all, we've got no experience that tells us to distribute them that way. So that is, why should we think that, given chance, it was very unlikely that the parameters, should fall within a range that permits life somewhere in the universe.
Right. So that's a question about the conditional probability of fine tuning given non-theism or atheism. It's like you're not convinced that it should be set so low.
I don't see any reason why it should be. I haven't seen. I mean, if we have lots and lots of universes, and we found that most of them were ones where it had been set in where it was outside a certain range, that might be the kind of reason to do it. But other than that, I can't see. I mean, after all, one reason why it might look low, guessed, is because of the scale on which you choose to measure it. So if you choose a certain kind of scale, something, then it might look as if there's a very small region in the set of real numbers for that quantity to fall into permits life. I use small in an informal way here, of course it's uncountable. Then if you use a different scale, for instance, some monotonic transformation of that scale, it might turn out to be a very large region. If you use the log of that scale, you use the square root of that scale, something like that, it might be a much larger region of the set of real numbers that permit life. And it seems to be arbitrary in some ways which ones which scale you use. So pending some kind of argument about the natural scale on the basis of which we ought to make an assignment of probabilities, it seems to be completely arbitrary to think that the probability of life, of the parameters being such as to permit life, is very low given chance. So, for instance, think about the charge of the mass ratio of protons to electrons or something. If that lies within a certain quantity, it permits life. If it lies outside, if it was in a certain range, it permits life. If it lies outside that range, it doesn't. Sure, but depending on how you measure it, that range can be expanded or contracted, all depending on units of measurement. So it's kind of difficult to see why it should be forced upon us, or even seem plausible or natural to suppose that it's very unlikely that it should fall within that particular range.
Fair enough. And Dr. Norris had a follow-up. He's wondering if you're familiar with the paper by Nicholas Sallnow-Smith called Electrons in Love concerning fine-tuning, where he points out... Sorry?
No, tell me about it.
Well, so one thing that he points out is that on theism, or at least this common accounts of theism, God has ensouled various physical entities. We're souls, or are the ensouled bodies, whatever. But presumably God could have, instead of having to ensoul some complex biological life form, he could have ensouled something much less complex, maybe even like an electron. And presumably, if God could have made us in a sort of world that just had electrons or something else, there's not really any need to fine-tune the universe for complex biological life. So it's sort of a perhaps undercuts the assumption that the a prior on the universe being fine-tuned for biological life given theism is high. Or maybe it might not need to be very high at all.
I see. I mean, that sounds interesting, but can we just go through? So the premise that if God existed, then the universe would be fine-tuned for life. Or, sorry, if God existed, then the universe would permit life.
Right.
That still is the argument that is now unlikely because God could have done it in a whole load of other ways. Right.
I mean, assuming by life we have some biological notion, right? Why? At least it's supposed to. It might undercut the evidence or reason for thinking that as such, a universe that's life permitting would be likely on theism, right? Since God could have equally created a universe which was not life permitting, but had the sort of things, or at least some things that he could ensoul and could enter into loving relationships with him, and so on.
So let's see now. So the argument was meant to be, if God existed, then it would be very likely that life exists. If God didn't exist, then it's very unlikely that life exists. Life does exist, therefore that's evidence that God exists. That's the sort of Bayesian tuning argument. And the objection is to the premise that if God existed, then it's very likely that life would exist. Yeah.
Right.
I'm not seeing why that's right, because of course the argument is that God could make life exist very easily. And that doesn't show that his existence makes life less likely. If anything, it shows that his existence makes life more likely.
No, well, the idea is that this is at least supposed to undercut whatever reasons we might have for thinking that God would choose a life-permitting universe over one that's not life-permitting. Because after all, if his intent is just to create a world where there are ensouled minds that can enter into a loving relationship with him and perhaps engage with each other, then he could create such a world in which doesn't and perhaps could not have biological life, since he could ensoul something much more simple, or at least non-living, for that purpose.
Oh, I see. So tell me this. This sounds like a way of. Okay, good. So I can see how the other one. You put it like this. Look, God could have created life in millions and millions of ways. Right? There's millions of kinds of ways he could have created life. So given that he did exist, it's very unlikely. There's no particular reason to think he would have created life in just the way that we actually find it. He could have done it in all of these other ways, like with making electrons conscious or whatever. And so the probability of life, posterior of life, given God's existence, is actually pretty low. But the posterior of this life as it actually is, given God's existence, is pretty low, because there are millions of other ways in which he could have done it as well. That sounds like a good idea. Yeah,
basically, although if by life, so I take it then in like the standard fine-tuning argument, by life, we're talking about at least something like the sort of biological life we see. I mean, maybe it could be much different that would still count as life. But I'm not counting something like an ensouled electron as a living thing, not in the relevant sense.
I see, good, yeah.
Not the sort of thing that would require a lot of fine-tuning, at least.
Exactly, that's right, good. So in a way, the argument's a bit like, people say sometimes, like an argument that I set for students, if you say, if you deal a pack of cards and you get 13 all in the same suit, you'll think probably that the pack had been fixed, okay? But if you deal a pack of cards and get some random selection, you wouldn't think the pack had been fixed. And yet both of those are equally, neither one is more likely. The random selection, the specific random selection, is no more likely than having them all in the same suit. Why is the first one surprising and the second one isn't? Or why is the first one a sign of being fixed and the second one isn't? And the answer is because the posterior, if they'd been fixed, they'd have been very unlikely to. If they'd been fixed, your probability of getting this random selection would have been very low, in fact. Whereas if they'd been fixed, your probability of getting this very salient selection of all in the same suit would have been quite high. And that's the difference. And similarly here, the point is that we are, in a sense, what his argument is good. So that then makes the argument quite interesting, because what he's saying is we're in a situation, it looked like we've got a really salient, interesting situation in life where we've got our conscious life, and there are all these other situations where there's no life. But in fact, what he's saying is there's nothing special about our, given that God's omnipotent, there's nothing special about our situation. Our situation is just one of billions of possible situations,
right,
in which there could have been life. And it's very unlikely that God would have chosen to produce life, as far as we know, in the form that we actually see it, as you say, rather than in these other forms. So yeah, if that's the way the argument is working, then I think that's quite a good argument. And I have some. I mean, I have to read the paper. It sounds to me like he's doing something interesting there. Yeah.
Right, and so the theism doesn't really predict, absent some further hypothesis, the fine-tuning data.
Exactly, because I mean that's one of the things about Bayesianism and why it often gives counterintuitive results is because you've got to look at all of our evidence. And conditional on all of our evidence doesn't mean the fact that there's life or the fact that there's consciousness. It means the fact that there is this particular form of life and consciousness, and you have to ask how likely would that have been in the hypothesis of theism versus the hypothesis of anti-theism. And there, I think, I think he's got a good case that actually it would have been lower than you think. So, I mean, as I said, I don't know the paper, so I don't know A, whether he's Bayesian, and B, whether he interprets the argument that way, but I can sort of see a way to think about the argument that would make it plausible and interesting, yeah.
All right. So I had a question moving back to some more decision theory stuff, although it's not really a decision theory problem, it's more like a probability problem. The Sleeping Beauty problem, I assume you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
Do you? I was just, as a first question, what is your response to the problem? Does you have?
Well, I guess I have to say, I haven't thought about it much for a while, but I guess that would be a third, I suppose.
Right. And so I was wondering if we could sort of transform this into a sort of decision problem, where we think of each bet, say, for others who are listening, in the Sleeping Beauty problem, Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday night, and a coin is tossed, and if the coin lands, I think it was, how do they put it? If it lands heads, she'll be interviewed only once on Monday, and then put back to sleep. And if it lands tails, she'll be interviewed on both Monday and Tuesday, and put back to sleep in between those 2 days. But importantly, when she's put to sleep on Monday, she's given some pill, or at least made to forget that she was interviewed, so that when she's interviewed on Tuesday, she doesn't remember that she was interviewed on Monday. And the question is, during an interview, how likely should she find it that, what probability should she assign to the claim that the coin was flipped heads on Sunday? And so you probably agree with the thirder position on that. So
yes, it's a while since I've thought about this, but I guess my instinctive intuition would be to go for the third position.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. So I was wondering if we could frame this as a sort of decision problem where, aside from just saying what her credence is, like perhaps we can form it as a bet so, well, I guess actually one response to these sort of bet framings, because after all, we could just say that, well, if she bets on tails each time, we're going to expect that she'll do better. That seems to at least suggest that, at least in the long run, and also on each individual bet on average, this suggests that really her credence shouldn't be half-half, but it should tilt towards tails. What do you think of the response suggested by Lewis and perhaps others, that sometimes the fair betting odds and a sort of rational credence of the relevant outcomes can come apart, right? And that maybe the fair betting odds in this case is not 50-50, but all the same, the credence in those two outcomes should be 50-50.
Yeah. I mean, part of my issue with that is just understanding what credence is supposed to mean then. I mean, Lewis himself obviously takes a kind of functionist view about what belief is. So belief is just a state of your brain that has certain kinds of causes and certain kinds of effects and interacts with other states of your brain in certain ways. That's what belief is. And nothing that doesn't satisfy those conditions gets to count as belief. But one of the things by which we identify belief, if we're functionists, I guess, would be something like your betting odds. And so I think it would be reasonable to ask someone like Lewis, if you think, well, those are your fair betting odds, but it's not what you ought to believe, then what do you mean by what you ought to believe? Well, I mean, is there some kind of figure in my head or something like that. It's supposed to be what I believe that comes apart from my choices in these cases. And the question is, what makes it rational to have that degree of belief rather than some other degree of belief? So I guess those are my sorts of questions as to why you would want to describe this as a case where fair betting odds and rational credence are apart. I mean, I can see the sort of case for 50-50 because of course you start out 50-50. And when you wake up, in a sense, you sort of think, well, I was expecting to get this evidence. It's not something that you didn't expect. So in a sense, you shouldn't change your mind about anything. Of course, when you wake up the second time on the Tuesday, I can't remember exactly how you frame it, when you wake up the second time on the Tuesday, you're getting evidence which you might not have got. It's true that you wouldn't have known that you weren't getting it if you weren't getting it, but it's still evidence that you could have failed to get. So I think there's nothing wrong with starting out 50-50 and then becoming a thirder when you've been woken up. As I say, I agree with you that I think that's the sensible betting odds to have. That kind of what was behind my instinct about saying a third in this case. So being 2-to-1 that it was tails when you've been woken up. And then just wondering if we divorce fair betting odds from rational credence, just wondering what rational credence is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that seems like a fair criticism to me.
What do you do you have a view on this case? Do you have a thought about what we should do in this example?
Oh yeah, I'm fairly strongly in the thirder camp. It seems that there's this and other arguments seem to lead. I guess it was Andy Egan's article where he presents a couple other arguments. The straightforward probability one where we assess, and then there's also ones related to long-term outcomes. There's also similar problems which seem to lead to similar conclusions. So I think that's But it is still the sort of challenge that halfers like Lewis and others will have or continue to put forth, although there's not many defenders of the view today, is that, well, there seems to be a somewhat plausible principle that unless we've received new evidence, there's no reason to update our priors, which as being half-half. So what is the new evidence that she's received here that will warrant updating those priors? And it might not be so easy to state what those are.
Yeah, that's right. So the evidence is the proposition that I'm awake now. And of course, you might think, she knew she was going to get that. But I mean, I guess it depends on how you think. I mean, this sort of shows the extent to which I haven't thought about this problem. But my sort of way to think about it would be: there's a way to think about the proposition I'm waking up now, according to which you can't even believe that proposition until it's true. Okay? Until the time that it's describing. And so, in a sense, you are getting new evidence. You are getting new belief. A belief you couldn't have held at any time beforehand. And it's evidence that you might not have got. So there's a sense in which you are getting something new. That's why. I mean, even setting that aside, I mean, what is the rational underpinning of principle that you shouldn't change your beliefs until you get new evidence? Where's the you can just as you go on.
Well, I guess the concern is it's assuming that the prior we had was appropriate for what we knew about the world, and for example, we're told that the coin is fair, and so our credence that the coin would or did come up heads is going to be half, given that it's a fair coin. Unless we have some new data or some new reason to think that either that credence was false or that something in fact occurred. What is it that would, I mean, if we're a Bayesian about updating our probabilities, what is it that would be conditionalizing on that would lead to a new probability?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose it depends on what you think conditional Bayesianism says. I mean, Bayesianism says if you learn a proposition, then your new probability distribution should be the old one conditional on that proposition. I mean, that's consistent with the view that your abilities can change over time for other reasons, just for no reason at all. The argument, I guess, for not doing that is there is a sort of Dutch book argument for conditionalization, the Lewisian argument. But that argument depends on quite specific conditions to do with you telling the person in advance exactly what your strategy is going to be. And after all, if you're a subjective Bayesian, I guess you can say any coherent distribution of probabilities is rationally acceptable. So at different time slices of yourself have different such distributions. No one of them is being irrational by holding it. So where's the irrationality? Of course, the point you make is good, that if you do that, you're going to have to violate the principle. That is, you're going to have to violate this principle about chance. Then I'm somewhat skeptical about that because I'm skeptical about chance itself. I guess maybe that's probably the place where Lewis would push, I think.
Fair enough. We had another question from Timber, who was wondering if have written on or have thought about the St. Petersburg paradox. That's the one where it's a coin flipping. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah. But I guess the thing I'd say, I haven't written about St. Petersburg paradox, but I know what it is. So the natural response to the original version is just to say that there's declining marginal utility, and obviously that
doesn't work.
Responding to it. Sorry, go ahead. I missed that.
Oh no, I was just saying, but yeah, I'm familiar with the responses because the idea is that you can just change the game slightly so that you win some amount of utility.
That's right. So if you replace the money amounts in the original game with the corresponding utility amounts, then that response is going to work. It's not going to work. That's right. So then the thing to say would be, one thing you might say is just to say, well, you can have bounded utilities. So that response is going to help. Now, how plausible bounded utilities is, I don't know. I think it's in reality, it probably has got quite a lot going for it. But there are reasons why you might not want to have bounded utilities as well. So one reason I was thinking about the other day was to do with just think about separateness of persons, right? So think about ethical reasons why you value human beings and human lives. I mean, you might have ethical reasons for thinking that every additional life is worth the same, however many lives you've already got. So the difference between saving 100 people and saving 101 people, ethically speaking, is the same as the difference between saving 2 people and saving 3 people. If you do think that, and you think that it's rationally permissible for your utility function to capture only ethical concerns, it looks as though there could be cases in principle where you can't even have bounded utility functions. Then, the St. Petersburg paradox is, an intuitive difficulty. I mean, quite what should go, I don't know. But I think those are the sorts of, that's the cases where I think it's the most severe kind of problem, I guess.
I see.
Do you have a view on it yourself?
No, I'm not. I've just been kind of reading about it recently, so I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of difficult to know what to think. I mean, when you talk to economists, they just say, "Oh yeah, you just have bounded utility." Of course, as you say, that's not good. You just have. And there are other sorts of problems as well. Have you heard about things like the Pasadena problem, for instance?
No, I'm not familiar.
There are other cases where you have where you just have non-convergent sequences, and in those other cases, you can get even weirder problems. That some responses to the St. Petersburg paradox don't help with. If you look up the paper, I think it's just called the Pasadena Game or something like that by Alan Hayek. Is a good discussion of another sort of successor to the St. Petersburg paradox. I guess in real life, my response would be that we probably do have bounded utilities. But as I say, there's a sort of difficulty with that, and I don't know what the best thing to say is about that difficulty.
Okay, I see. So you think like the bounded utility is sort of the way to go? Just
if you think about real cases, yeah.
I see.
There's no.
Okay.
Then if we think, as I say, but there's a difficulty with that because there may be a difficulty in principle with having bounded utilities. I'm just kind of not sure how serious to take that, but I think it may be a serious problem.
I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I had more questions related to Newcomb's problem. So Corliss Swain has a 1987 article where she offers an argument against one boxing. And a notable passage from that is as follows. Since whether she becomes a millionaire depends on whether there is already $1 million in the box, she must conclude that even if she can make it more likely that the predictor predicted she would take one box by taking one box, she cannot thereby increase her chances of becoming a millionaire. What do you think of this assertion?
I got it. So can you read the first bit of that sentence to me again? I missed it.
Yeah. Since whether she becomes a millionaire, like the subject in Newcomb's problem, depends on whether there is already $1 million in the box, she must conclude that even if she can make it more likely that the predictor predicted she would take one box, by one boxing, she cannot thereby increase her chances of becoming a millionaire.
I see. Yeah, got it. In a sense, I would agree with all of that, but just deny that it follows that she ought not to one box. So, of course, it's true that in the sense of subjective probability, she can make it more likely that she was predicted to one box, where make here doesn't have a causal sense. It simply means her one boxing is evidence that is for her, it's very strong evidence that she was predicted to one box. But of course, in that sense of make it more likely, in that subjective sense, she can also make it more likely that there was $1 million all along in the box. In the other sense, in the sense of increasing the chance, where that means something like the objective probability, that increasing the chance has some kind of causal interpretation. That sense, of course, it's true that she can't increase the chance of there being $1 million in the opaque box. That's quite right. But the whole question is, why should we base our decisions on what increases the chance of getting what we want, rather than on what makes more likely what we want in the sense that we isolated first? After all, the people who base their decisions on what increases the chance of getting $1 million really end up not getting $1 million. Whereas the people who base their decisions on what makes it more likely do end up getting $1 million. So that's prima facie empirical evidence that basing your decisions on what increases the chance of something, where that's inconsistent with the evidential theory, is a bad idea. I guess that's what I'd say to that argument.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like it seems to me that there's some inappropriate switch in what sort of probability she's considering here. Because I mean, after all, like, okay, if we grant that the subject can make it more likely, or that she was predicted to one box, and that she was predicted to one box, I mean, if she was predicted to one box, then it entails or near enough that there's $1 million in there. Then why wouldn't we think that, at least by her life, she's making it more likely that by one boxing that she'll become a millionaire?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, she does put her finger on the sort of basic intuitive nerve behind two boxing, which is that there is a natural sense in which you can't do anything about what's in the box. And that's perfectly true. The whole point is that Newcomb's problem is a case where there are strong empirical grounds to think that basing your decisions on your natural sense of, well, what you can do something about is a bad idea, because people who do that don't get rich. We should learn from that. That's the right response. But that doesn't change the fact, which she was right to point out, that that's what people particularly advert to when they first come across Newcomb's problem, and it's why two boxing still has quite a lot of popularity amongst people who first think about the problem. And many philosophers as well have thought about it for a long time.
Right. You might be familiar with it, a paper by Roy Sorensen from 1983. Let me just find what the title of that was. Newcomb's problem, recalculations for the one boxer, and he presents this somewhat interesting argument against one boxing. But instead of just presenting the whole argument, I'll list out what I think are the most contentious premises and see if I can get your thoughts on those. The first one is necessarily if some subject finally decides to perform a particular act, then there's some time prior to the time of the intended act at which A is sure of this final decision to perform that act.
That seems plausible enough. Is that supposed to entail two boxing by itself?
No. There's the second. Well, there's a few premises, but I could find the rest of them. But there's two that I was wondering if you find plausible or not. The second one is essentially if it is logically possible that there is a time prior to A's taking only the opaque box at which A is sure that there's $1 million in the opaque box, then this sureness would activate the sufficient condition for deciding to take both boxes.
Okay. And
so I guess the idea here is that, well, given that earlier premise, insofar as you're sure that you'll take only one box, then you can be thereby sure that there's $1 million in there. And for some reason, that's enough to compel you to take both boxes then.
Yeah, okay, I see. So I suppose that's the bit that I reject. I mean, one thing is that if the subject knows all this in advance, if the subject knows in advance that being sure that there's $1 million in the opaque box is sufficient for deciding to take both boxes, then I don't see it's possible that he can ever be at a point where his final decision is to take one box.
Right.
If his final decision is, if he's never going to have a final decision if he's never going to be sure that his final decision will be to take one box, he's never going to be sure that there's $1 million in the opaque box. So there seems to be those premises seem to be in a kind of tension, inconsistent, right?
Right. Although there's a more general issue here that maybe he's getting at, is that, well, I think some people have argued that the motivations for one boxing might be unstable in that, well, as soon as you find yourself moving toward taking one box, that'll give you evidence that there's, in fact, 1 million and 1,000 there, and that might push you towards taking two boxes, or then you're kind of swung back and forth. I mean, what do you think about the claims of instability of that sort?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how of course, if you're an evidential decision theorist, you're not going to have this kind of instability, right? Because as long as your degrees of belief are not extreme, but if you assume, supposing you're 90% confident or 99% confident that there's $1 million in the opaque box, okay, it's still true that conditional on taking both boxes, your confidence is almost zero that there's $1 million in the opaque box. So you've got no reason to change your mind to two boxing at that point if you're an evidential decision theorist. Similarly, if you're almost certain that if you're very close to certain that there's nothing in the opaque box, you've still got very good reason if you're an evidential decision theorist to take one box, because conditional on taking one box is $1 million in the opaque box. So I don't think that sort of instability affects the evidential theory. The other thing I would say, there is a different kind of instability which does affect it, which is that the evidential decision theorist is going to know that he or she will regret what they've done when they've done it. So the evidential decision theorist is going to take one box and he's then going to know before opening it that if he'd taken both boxes, he'd have got more. That's true. So doing something that you know you'll regret is one of the costs of the evidential theory. But of course, we're often in situations where we know, we do things that we know we'll regret. And the evidential decision theorist doesn't care about regret. He just cares about money. So I don't think that's going to be a reason necessarily not to one box. The thing I was going to say was that, of course, there is a similar, not the same, but a similar kind of instability that affects all the decision theory as well. And this is in the cases, the sort of, do you know the kind of what are called the death in Damascus type cases?
Yeah, of course. And there's another case I was thinking about that I think it was taken that there is there's the correct rational decision that you will later regret. What was the one with the taxi driver that you either pay or don't pay or something like that?
Oh, you mean the Harvard example about being in the desert? And
right, I think that was one. Isn't that taken to one of those cases? But sorry, go on with the point you were going to make.
No, that's quite good. So all I was going to say was definitely Damascus. Just as you know, you can wherever you go, the person will catch you. You know the person's a very good predictor of where you're going to go. As you head towards one city, you become more and more confident that he's waiting for you in that city. So you start wanting to go to the other one. The causal decision theories. So you end up sort of wavering back and forth, I guess, if you can't make the decision all at once. And that's a kind of, if instability is a problem, then it seems to be a problem there. And the taxi driver one is a case where you're in a desert and you're going to die of thirst, and then there's someone who offers to drive you to safety, on the condition that when you get to safety, you'll go to the ATM and give him $100. You know, and he knows that you know, and in fact, it's common knowledge that once he's driven you there, he can't stop you from just running away without giving him the money. So he'll only drive you if you promise to give him the money when you get there, but you've got no incentive to, you all know that you've got no incentive to do it once you reach safety. So there it looks as though rational agents end up not surviving and irrational agents end up surviving, because the rational agent, assuming you can't tell lies, or assuming he can tell whenever you're lying, a rational agent couldn't sincerely promise to abide by a commitment to give the taxi driver money when he gets there. Even though this means that, and so rational agents are just going to end up worse off in that situation than rational ones. So that's a sort of case. That's a slightly different case. It's not a case where there's instability, but it's a case. Do you know these sorts of functional decision theory type people? So people like Eliezer and so on. They sort of cite examples like this in favor of their own approach to decision theory.
Right. I sort of actually had just a follow-up question about when you say one boxing and other recommendations of evidential decision theory, while rational, are options or acts that you will later, they'll recommend acts that you will later regret, or at least might later regret. But couldn't we come back on that and say that regret is based on counterfactual beliefs that are not really warranted, right? Because if you say, well, I regret taking one box because had I taken 2 boxes, I would have gotten more. But you might think that the counterfactual is backtracking and that, well, had you taken 2 boxes, really there would have not have been that $1 million to receive. And so you would not have received it.
Accurate. That's in some ways quite a sensible thing to say. And of course, the cause, if you base feelings of regret on causal counterfactuals, then I guess I'd say who cares about regret? But then maybe a more sensible to say would be just you say, well, then don't base your feelings of regret on causal counterfactuals, base them on backtracking counterfactuals. The only reservation I'd have about that is that I would hesitate to describe evidential theory in terms of counterfactuals that are backtracking. So one thing that people sometimes say is that, look, causal decision theory has non-backtracking counterfactuals, and in their place, evidential theory has backtracking counterfactuals. And I think from a couple of things you were saying earlier on, I got the sense you too might be sympathetic with that.
Whether their backtracking is going to be case dependent, right? Or whether the appropriate reading is backtracking.
I mean, just the idea that there's a proposition, a counterfactual proposition, which plays the role in evidential decision theory that normal sort of non-backtracking counterfactual plays in causal decision theory. Jack Spencer and I read a paper recently where we sort of argued that something really important about evidential decision theory that gets missed out by that approach, because it's really important in evidential decision theory. It uses conditional probabilities, and in Lewis's approach, those conditional probabilities are not the probability of any proposition, factual or not, backtracking or not. And in fact, if you replace, Horgan does this, for instance, if you treat evidential decision theory as having backtracking or sometimes backtracking counterfactuals in the place of the non-backtracking counterfactuals that the causal decision theory uses, then you will end up with other Newcomb type cases as well. So the only theory that's not Newcombizable in that way is evidential theory involving conditional probabilities as presented by Jeffrey. So there's something very special about conditional probabilities, and what's special about it is that they're not probabilities of any proposition. That makes a difference. It makes a difference. It has a difference for ethics, we argue as well. But I guess the only point I'm making this connection is that it makes a difference for which counterfactuals you're appealing to. So just in a sort of roundabout way, getting back to what you said, right thing, the really consistent way to think about things from the evidentialist perspective would not be to say, well, that's fine to have regret, but you should base it on a different kind of counterfactual. Right thing to say, but you should, regret is just a silly idea in the first place. Regret is pointless. I mean, the point of regret is, after all, to teach you, presumably, give you expectations about what's going to happen in the future, but we've already got those, so that's not going to make any difference. So generally, I think regret is a bad idea on the evidential theory, and I think it would be unmotivated ultimately from the evidentialist perspective to take regret based on this other kind of counterfactual rather than just to dispense with it altogether. I'm not entirely sure about that, but that's kind of my own sort of current feelings about regret.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But there's obviously a lot more to explore there. I was just wondering about, on the backtracking thing, what you think of the following sort of argument that I sort of extract from Yemima Menaham's 1986 paper. Where they consider many iterations, or the idea that maybe many people are simultaneously engaging in a Newcomb problem. And so you think that, okay, well, if the individual case is non-backtracking, or the counterfactual assessment of those other cases are non-backtracking, then the collective case is non-backtracking. And then, so if we say that, well, if the collective case is non-backtracking, then had everyone chosen differently, then the predictor would have been very inaccurate. But, right, since it's, we suppose that it gets it right in the actual case, but then counterfactually it would get it wrong on the non-backtracking reading. And so, but we suppose that in no circumstances is the predictor very inaccurate, even counterfactual. And hence, so the individual case is not non-backtracking.
Good. So I think what I'd say about that is that when we say if in no circumstances the predictor is very inaccurate, if that means in no counterfactual circumstances the predictor is very inaccurate, then indeed the individual case is not non-backtracking. But that's not the standard assumption that we make about the individual case. So I suppose I'd wonder why we want to say in the first case that if the individual case is non-backtracking, then the collective case is non-backtracking as well. I mean, is it an example where he or she makes one prediction for everyone, or is it an example where the predictor makes individual predictions for each?
If I recall, it's individual predictions for each.
Maybe it doesn't matter, but yeah. I mean, so if you think individual predictions for each, so if agent A had chosen differently, why think, if that's non-backtracking, if that's not a backtracking conditional, why think that if agent A had chosen differently, then agent B would have chosen? Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. Right, so it's saying the individual case is non-backtracking, then if everyone had chosen differently, then the predictor would have got it wrong. Exactly. Then what I'd do is I'd say, fine, everyone chose differently, the predictor would have been inaccurate. That's right. And there are possible circumstances in which the predictor is inaccurate. It's just that we're quite confident that those are non-actual circumstances. That's quite consistent, but it means dropping her interpretation of the claim in those circumstances is the predictor very inaccurate.
Right. So I guess we don't want to say, well, we could admit that there's some possible world in which the predictor is very inaccurate. I mean, because after all, such a world might be quite rare, but statistically it should be possible. But we want to say that our expectation that the actual world or some nearby, likely world, would be one in which the predictor is very inaccurate, is very low. We wouldn't expect that to be actual or nearly actual, so to speak.
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. So we can think there's in a sense, in one sense, there's an easily accessible non-nearby world in which the predictor's wrong, got it completely wrong. But we're very, very confident that that's not the actual world.
Right. So it feels like what the proponent of the backtracking reading of the counterfactuals wants to do is, well, given that we're supposing that the predictor is quite reliable, it's quite accurate. That's the accuracy of the predictor is sort of one of those things we want to keep fixed when we're assessing the counterfactual statements.
Well, I suppose it depends on how you set up the case. Right? I mean, you can have a version of Newcomb's problem where you do keep it fixed, and then that would be a case. I mean, you could just stipulate it's a case where in nearby possible worlds the predictor gets it right, and then that would be a case where the the relevant counterfactuals for causal decision theory are indeed backtracking. But making that stipulation about the case does distinguish it from Nozick's case, and you can just stipulate which one gets called Newcomb's problem. Doesn't matter, but you can just stipulate there are these two different kinds of cases. Certainly, it's possible to have a case where the predictor is actually, we're very confident, accurate, but there are nearby possible worlds where it isn't. And then the whole question is, what's the right thing to do in that case? Is it what the evidentialist theory recommends, or is it what the causal theory recommends? Because in that case, they're making different recommendations.
Fair enough. I think so. We've been. I think we're at the end of the time, so we'll probably wrap it up around here. So again, thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments.